Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Emily Harding, Director of the Intelligence, National Security, and Technology Program here at CSIS. We work at the intersection of intelligence and technology to anticipate how rapidly evolving technologies are changing national security. From biotech to AI, quantum to space tech, deep fakes to disinfo, disruptive tech is changing the game for intelligence. Today, we are thrilled to host a special guest whose day job it is to anticipate these changes and help Australia prepare for the future. Andrew Shearer has been Australia's Director General of National Intelligence since 2020. He is the principal advisor to the Prime Minister on all intelligence matters. He has an impressive long record of public service, including National Security Advisor to 2 Australian Prime Ministers and several senior diplomatic posts. And we are pleased to welcome him back to CSIS. He served here as the Senior Advisor on Asia-Pacific Security, and we continue to count him as a true friend of the Center. He was here for 4 years, I believe, right before I came. So I'm sorry we didn't overlap, but I'm really pleased to sit down with you now. So we could cover literally the world in this conversation, but in the 45 minutes that we have, we want to be sure we give the audience some time to ask questions. So let's start off with the really big stuff. Let's talk geopolitics. Right now, there are 2 major conflicts ongoing, one in Ukraine and in Gaza, along with a host of smaller ones. Deep concerns about tension with China, rising authoritarianism. That is enough to keep any intel enterprise very busy. So how do you think about setting your priorities, especially for an organization like yours that really punches above its weight on the global stage?
Emily, first, thank you for hosting me, and it's great to see so many friends and colleagues here today. This is a really challenging time for our intelligence communities, and when I meet with my counterparts, I'm struck by the pressures on them. There are all the external geopolitical pressures that you talked about, but there are also all of the normal pressures that go along with running an organisation, and I think we'll probably touch on some of those a little later in the conversation. But to me, one of the things that comes out most strongly, given the sort of panoply of global threats and challenges, is the power of partnership, is the fact that none of us can be all-seeing or all-knowing. None of us has truly global coverage, but together we can make the best possible fist of providing our governments with strategic warning and actionable insights both into the threats that we're facing and the opportunities that we have to shape our world for the better. So when I think about this problem set, right at the core of everything is the Five Eyes partnership, the power of that being global, the duration of that partnership, the 8 decades of trust building, of building a culture of sharing and protecting each other's information. That's a really, really deep foundation and an outstanding platform from which to deal with the threats and challenges we're facing, maybe not with complacency, but with more confidence than we would have if we were trying to do that on our own.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that Five Eyes partnership. It has proven, as you say, immeasurably valuable in the post-World War II period. What started as, I think, a marriage of convenience in a lot of ways has really turned into such a robust information sharing exchange. In my time in the intelligence community, I remember sitting side by side with my colleagues from Australia, with my colleagues from the UK, from Canada, and every time you sit down and you talk to these folks, it's like sitting down with a really close cousin that you share everything with, but at the same time has a slightly different viewpoint than you do. And that exchange is just so invaluable. So in your view, how do we take the strength of that partnership and continue to grow together as allies?
So I think one of the things I spend a lot of time working on and emphasising with my Australian counterparts is the need to think differently about intelligence as an enterprise and to break down some of our internal stovepipes. Both Australia and the United States have been on this path for some time now. In the US system, of course, 9/11 triggered substantial changes to the way your IC is organised and works together. We've had a similar journey in Australia to develop more of a sense of genuine community among our agencies. But I do think we've got some more work to do. In Australia, about every 6 years, we have an independent review of our community. And the 2017 review set up my organisation, the Office of National Intelligence, and my role as the Prime Minister's principal advisor, but it also charged me with integrating our intelligence efforts more effectively, and that is a huge focus for us. It's thinking about how we can use the complementary capabilities and legal authorities of our different agencies in new ways together. And I think the future of intelligence will be different ints, if you like, working together in small teams that come together to go after a particular problem. Sometimes they'll be long term. We have a counter foreign interference task force, for example, which brings together our intel agencies and law enforcement. It's been very effective. That will have a continuing role. But in other cases, these teams will come together, deploy against a problem, and then reform and do something else. I think we need to translate some of that thinking to the Five Eyes partnership and to be thinking not only SIGINT to SIGINT, HUMINT to HUMINT, etc., but how we bring that multi-agency integrated campaigning kind of model to some of the problems that we're facing today.
I know that my colleagues have been watching your reorganization with a lot of interest, because when, as you say, post 9/11 in our system, we decided to try to unite the intelligence community as more of a community. But the US community is a behemoth compared to Australia. And while we've made a lot of really great reforms, we don't think we've still quite gotten it right as far as the real integration. So watching you guys in 2017 reorganize and think just sort of differently and really creatively about what intelligence work should look like has been highly instructive. What can we steal from this very close ally who's doing such a good job with it?
We actually stole quite a bit from your experience, so I'm happy to kind of return the favour. I think the way I try to lead our community and that sense of community, build that sense of community is very focused on culture. Our individual agencies have long and storied and proud traditions and identities, and I think that's massively important that we retain that. Mm-hmm. It's important for a whole lot of reasons. Staff morale being one of them, retention of scarce staff, which we may touch on again later, but it's also really important for recruitment. So we need to retain that, but we also need to build a stronger sense of recognition of the roles and responsibilities of other agencies and the potential, as I said, to work more closely together to solve the massive problems that we're dealing with. So that's kind of the mindset that I bring to the problem. I think sometimes for Australia it is easier for us to kind of organise around a particular problem or a particular issue, and I'd like to think that some of the work we're doing in our mission management teams, for example, is helping to inform approaches here in the USIC as well. So I think there are lessons we can share. I mean, there are all the old bugbears of barriers to sharing, between agencies in our own systems, and then of course between systems. And again, we've made a lot of progress there during the war on terror. I think we did demonstrate that we can switch the default to sharing, and we can be highly effective if we do that. I think with some of the other problems you were talking about earlier, we need to take that same sort of mindset, that same sharing, campaigning mindset to those problems.
Absolutely. We like to joke here that where there's a will, there's a waiver. And one of the benefits to a crisis is that a lot of those barriers break down out of sheer necessity. And you do find the waivers. You find ways to work around the existing rules to really share. And one of the things about the current slate of challenges that we're facing is they're all urgent, they're all important, but thank goodness not a lot of them have reached crisis stage. So we're all sort of staring at each other like, we need to make this happen, but the question is, how do you create that urgency to get to a point where the sharing really works? One thing that we're focused on here at CSIS too is how that question about growing together, how you can use different pieces of technology to be sure that as allies we can share near instantaneously, and that we are putting in place different software solutions, hardware solutions that will let us move forward together as opposed to diverge as we go down the inevitable paths of our different procurement regimes. Right. I know that when it comes to the Five Eyes, this is something we all really need to focus on. How are you thinking about that problem of growing together?
I think it's a massive challenge, but again, I think there's reason for optimism. In Australia, we are working very hard on a top secret cloud initiative where we're hoping that we will be in a position to take that initiative forward. And what that will do is obviously transform how we do our work as agencies, but also it'll open up a shared collaborative space that will really, I think, reinforce this sense of working together as a genuine community and bringing all those different capabilities to bear on problems, the ability to share vast amounts of data and to work on it together will be a massive change for us as a community, but it will also make us interoperable with the US IC and also with our British colleagues who are moving in that direction as well. And so as we thought about that project, we were designing in interoperability with our most important partners right from the start, and also, frankly, sharing from the experiences of the US and the UK who'd been down that path a little ahead of us, has helped, I think, us think through the problems, avoid some of the pitfalls, and I'd like to think get to a better solution sooner. So I think that's a really powerful demonstration of how we can learn from each other. I think as we move into the world of artificial intelligence, there's also a massive amount that we can learn and share. Patrick Kennedy's here today. He's our guru on this, and he's been doing a great job raising the level of understanding and knowledge in our organisation and more widely about AI. But that's a problem and an opportunity that we can do so much better on if we do it in a shared way. So I think there are these opportunities for us to really deepen our existing cooperation. It's more than an opportunity, though. I'd say it's actually an imperative, given what we're up against.
Absolutely. I think that one of the really magical things about these partnerships, they're so close that you can disagree with each other, right? You can sit down and you can hash it out and say, well, the way that you're doing it, I'm not sure is the right way to do it, and sort of question the way that you're doing it as well. That exchange of information and exchange of views and kind of check on good judgment is the most valuable thing about these super close partnerships. Well, so looking out a little bit broader, I mean, the Five Eyes is well established as a very strong relationship, but there are some new partnerships emerging in the region and sort of across the globe. How are you thinking about expanding that sort of circle of trust and bringing in new partners?
So I think, again, this is an imperative, Emily, as well. So for us, when we think very much about the Five Eyes being at the core of everything else, but as you say, partners in the Quad, for example, are becoming more important. Japan, which has been transforming its own strategic posture in recent years, is very forward-leaning in terms of where it wants to get on intelligence capability and cooperation with others. There's a lively debate about whether Japan should or shouldn't become the sixth eye. But what I find really encouraging about that is a deep understanding across the Japanese political system and Japanese agencies that they need to lift up their level of capability. And I think we being Australia and the United States are perfectly positioned to help them with that. I was in Tokyo a month or two ago and having exactly these discussions about how we think about personnel security and security vetting, information security, cyber security, and so forth. And there's a huge appetite there to learn from all of us and to lift that base. So I think Japan will be a critical partner in this equation. I think some of the key Southeast Asian countries are becoming more and more interested in cooperating with us, and we do a lot more intelligence diplomacy in the region. We're increasingly coordinating those efforts with the US and other partners. So Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, very pressing, very important part of the world for Australia. Spending more and more time meeting government leaders, senior officials, and providing briefings for them on a whole range of things, and focusing very much on their priorities, which are often somewhat different. Often they want to understand about changes to the climate system. They want to understand trends in transnational crime, illegal fishing. Some of these problems are more real and more immediate to those countries. So being able to go in there and provide them with intelligence assessments, and also to boost their own capabilities. Many of those leaders want their own objective sources of advice and assessment, and we have technical advisors in several of the Pacific countries helping them generate that capacity for themselves. And then lastly, I would add growing interest in tighter intelligence cooperation with European countries. I think for a while there was a sort of view in Europe and perhaps in Australia and our region that we were kind of separate and we had a different set of priorities. I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East, continuing challenges in the Indo-Pacific have reminded us all that security is deeply interconnected and that what happens in one theatre can have very direct and immediate implications elsewhere. So I'm finding much more interest from European counterparts in increasing our exchanges coming to Australia. Services like, for example, in the last few months, we've had visits from the Finnish and Swedish services to Australia and a range of others. They are not countries I would have reeled off a list of priority partners for Australia probably 5 or 10 years ago, but we're doing much more with those services in Europe.
Yeah, talk about punching above their weight. Those are the two big ones. I'm glad you brought up the intelligence diplomacy phrase, because that's so important. I get lots of questions these days from journalists about, why is Director Burns going so-and-so, and why is it him that's doing these things? And I have to remind them that intelligence diplomacy is not new. There's something that is quite powerful about being able to sit down and exchange information in more of an apolitical setting that can really help build those alliances, and especially in a place, as you point out, as diverse as the Pacific, where there are a lot of places that have a real specific need when it comes to fishing or when it comes to climate change, and we can share information that might be sort of tangential to security in one place but critically important to security in another. And using those relationships to really build those ties is so important.
I think that's right. We coordinate our intelligence diplomacy activities very closely with our diplomatic colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and also defence colleagues who, of course, have their own pattern of defence engagement right through the region. So we want to be aligned with policy. But there are conversations we can have that are slightly different, as you say. We can present a sort of dispassionate, objective analysis of the situation. If we're able to share that with our counterparts, we can broaden the alignment between us and our partners on what's happening in the strategic environment around us. And my experience over a number of years is that the more alignment there is in those assessments, the more likely it is that policymakers are going to be able to agree on what to do about the situation. So I think there's a lot of virtue in this area. You're right, we've been doing this for decades, but sometimes we lose muscle memory. I think we built up quite a bit during the Cold War, and maybe in the few decades since then we lost some of this muscle memory, and we're all working hard to rebuild it.
Yeah, so you mentioned what we're up against. Let's talk about what we're up against. When it comes to this idea of strategic competition and a rising China or perhaps a risen China, and this question of what is China really pursuing in its global ambitions. This is something that clearly the U.S. has grappled with, and just in the last, I'd say, 10 years or so, I've seen the tenor of the conversation in Washington really shift from one of China's this fabulous emerging market, please let 1,000 flowers bloom, let U.S. businesses go in and do their thing, to really more of we're concerned about intellectual property theft. We're concerned about losing out national security secrets to the Chinese. We're worried about competition as opposed to sort of a benevolent joint rise. It's something that I think U.S. policymakers are going to continue to grapple with. But from the Australian perspective, what does great power competition mean for you?
So I think if you look back over the period that you just mentioned there, Emily, what we've seen is a return of geopolitics to the forefront of global affairs. I started my intelligence career in 1989, early 1990, showing my age.
Showing your wisdom, sir, your wisdom.
No, just age. And of course, the key events around that time were really, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as a, sort of young, sort of punky intelligence officer, I was a bit dismayed by all of that because I thought, I've joined this business right as the sort of backside falls out of it. And, of course, we all know that our business is very much alive and well, but really, we went into that very different phase where US power was unchallenged largely. I think in the background rather, it was actually being challenged from reasonably early on, certainly from around 2000 or the mid-2000, 2008-9, around that sort of period. I think the argument is pretty clear now that it was being challenged, but we had this broadly benign era, and countries were able to prosper. We were able to prioritise national development, building our infrastructure and our schools and our healthcare systems and so forth. And economic issues were largely separate from geopolitics. Well, of course, that has started to break down significantly, and I think, from my own experience of talking to and briefing Australian business leaders, the one event that really sort of broke the trance, if you like, was Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which I think just made something, real that had been apparent, but not quite so real. And for us, that's a complicated picture. Australia's benefited massively from a broadly open trading system. China is our largest trading partner, and China's economy will continue to play a very important role in our prosperity for the foreseeable future, which is one of the reasons, of course, why our government has been working to stabilise the bilateral relationship with Beijing, just as the Biden administration has been doing it. I think it's interesting. There's an interesting sort of symmetry to what's happening there. But at the same time, I think we recognise that in this much more sort of geopolitically charged environment, the resilience of our institutions has become much more important. Our supply chains, which were tested obviously during COVID, our political institutions being subjected to political interference by a whole range of actors. Our critical infrastructure is endangered by cyber penetrations of different types. And our higher education and our knowledge ecosystems are also being challenged at scale, I would say. So in this environment, I think building our national resilience becomes much more important, and you can see different countries doing that in different ways. And a big part of the sort of discourse with partners, including the Europeans, who I mentioned before, is, how do we think about that? How do we think about effective laws and enforcement to counter foreign interference in our systems, including online through disinformation or whatever? And again, there's an AI component to that. how do we harden our critical infrastructure? How do we do all these things to make our countries more secure while not undermining the fundamental openness of our economies and our societies that's generated so much of our prosperity over the years, and which we need to fund enhanced defence capabilities to deal with a more challenging world. There's an argument in Australia that national security and economics are somehow a kind of binary equation, but I think it's actually the wrong way to look at it. I think we need to do everything we can to make the national security overlay on our economies as minimal as possible while still protecting our future security. So it's a challenging picture. I think it means we spend much more time as an intelligence community working not only with traditional national security departments like Foreign Affairs or Defence, but with the so-called prosperity departments, with our Treasury, with our Industry Department, our Agriculture Department, our Education Department, and with the private sector. It's a very different operating environment. It has challenges for us as intelligence agencies. We're not always the most forthcoming, historically.
I don't know what you mean.
But, building out those shared partnerships, I think across government and sort of on a whole of nation, whole of society basis is where we are now and where we need to go further in the future.
Absolutely. I remember the Chinese effort to reject Australian wines a few years ago. I want you to know that I took one for the home team, and I went out and I bought about 15 bottles of Australian wine and drank it all with, love in my heart for
Thank you for your service.
It was tough duty, I know, tough duty. But this feature of current state of competition where the economic piece is so closely intertwined with the national security piece. One of our missions here at CSIS, and particularly with my program, the INT program, is trying to explain to people not inside the Beltway, why national security matters. And this is it. This question of economics and how, because there is, generally accepted global rules on free commerce and trade and transit, that those kinds of things mean good things for the pocketbooks of people in Australia and in Kansas and in Sweden. And that is why we have to try to preserve the peace in the international system. I think you're absolutely right about the invasion of Ukraine being a wake-up call. That was one of those, there would never be another war in Europe until suddenly there's another war in Europe. Mm-hmm. And I think the implications of that reach around the globe, clearly.
Totally.
I want to remind everybody, if you would like to ask a question, there's a button online that says Ask Questions, perhaps logically. Write one in there and it will pop up to me on stage and we can continue this conversation with the folks who are online. And for the folks who are here in the audience, I know you all have smartphones, you're perfectly allowed to pull them out and also ask a question that way as well. This question about resilience and the supply chain, and you said there's a role for AI there. Clearly, technology is revolutionizing the way that we do intelligence work and also revolutionizing the way that the economy works. We're seeing technology competition getting more intense. Some Western advances are eroding when it comes to especially China, also Russia, and then also just private sector entities that are really taking the lead in innovation in a lot of these critical technologies. What do you see as the implications of the technology competition?
So my starting point, Emily, is, when I think about the strategic contest, it's got a military component, it's got a diplomatic component, it's got an economic component, it's got an intel component. But right at I like to say, the centre of gravity in the contest is technology and the struggle for control of the sort of commanding heights of critical and emerging technologies and we, that's how a range of leaders, including China's leadership, see this. The other thing, and this isn't a unique observation by any means, but if you look historically at our national security systems, technology tended to come out of government. Mm-hmm. Advanced technologies tended to come out of, our defence apparatus, DARPA being the great example, and there's manifold, the internet, blah blah blah. There's lots of examples of that, and of course that's kind of turned on its head now, and we in government are kind of left often kind of chasing along behind. The emerging technologies, including potentially very disruptive technologies, are often coming out of the private sector. I think that means a few pretty profound things for government, right? It means we need to inject an element of humility into our thinking about this, that we're not the font of all knowledge. I think it makes partnerships, especially with the private sector, not just sort of important, but absolutely critical. Again, that word imperative. And I think it's interesting, your community, our community, we're all working hard on those partnerships. And like I said before, we're sort of assuming more risk. And I think that's the other thing, that, we tend to have systems that are, frankly, pretty risk averse, right? We have robust procurement rules, and that's important because the money we're spending is taxpayers' money. But if we don't reassess our risk appetite around technology and uptake of technology, I think we're going to fail. And so that takes you into the world to an uncomfortable world for many of us as officials. But I think that's the reality. Unless we're prepared to, as they say, to fail to succeed, to recognise that not all of these investments are going to work, that we shouldn't build sort of massive kind of, tomorrow's legacy system, and often they're legacy systems, frankly, by the time they're delivered, just because, that's how we roll. We need to kind of get over that stuff pretty quickly, and I think that's going to be challenging for our wider, political and financial and oversight systems. But that's a conversation we have to have, not only with the private sector, as I was saying, but with our overseers, whether they're up the hill and in the Congress, or our Parliament House, or our auditors and so forth. I think we have to bring a different mindset to that as well.
Absolutely, that risk aversion piece. My old boss, Senator Burr, used to say all the time that there is no technology committee on the Hill, so the Intelligence Committee sort of by default became the Technology Committee, because we saw the intelligence community grappling with these technology issues and grappling with what you're talking about with this rapid turnover, right? Where by the time a system is deployed, it's obsolete.
Right.
And trying to find ways to make both the executive branch and the legislative branch a little bit more risk tolerant. There's a reason that you don't hear fail fast in government. It just doesn't, it's not the way that they think. And trying to get to a point, especially where, an industry partner has something sitting on the shelf that's 80% of what you need, and the remaining 20% is not so critical to the mission. Like being able to just accept what's sitting on the shelf and buy it and implement it, as opposed to demanding, every 100% solution that you think you need. That's something we hear from industry here in the US all the time. That
is music to my ears, and I'll add a personal peeve that sits alongside that, and that is, again, because of our sort of the legacy of our bureaucratic history and culture, our agencies develop often in their own kind of silos. And the one thing that does my head in most as the head of our community is finding out that Agency X has been toiling away to develop a widget at, great cost. And over here, Agency Y is toiling away to develop a widget that's sort of 97% the same, but has a very special, unique, because our requirement is really unique thing happening over here. And often in the past, they haven't even, known about that. So one of the things we've put in place as part of our new National Intelligence Committee strategy is actually a set of principles that mandate sharing of new technology. So even knowledge that an agency is working in a particular area of technology, making that transparent right across our 10 agencies, and inviting any of the other agencies who want to be part of that to join. It's kind of, it doesn't sound like rocket science.
Right, it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that you expect to have to say, but yet. But yet. No, that's great progress. And, stuff like that, as you say, saves the taxpayer dollars so that you can be a little bit more risk acceptant with some of the other things that you're working on.
Right.
One thing that we see a lot in the US as well is the chasing of shiny objects, right? So there's the new innovation, and let's do innovation theater, let's go pursue that particular piece of shiny object, and then do the pilot program, and then it sort of withers on the vine. We did a project recently to look at which technologies actually are going to matter and which ones the U.S. should pursue. But everybody has a list. We had a list of 7, there was a list of 14, there was a list of 10.
Yeah.
When you look into the future, what do you think the most critical technologies are going to be for national security?
Oh, wow. So one of the things I did after I became Director General was set up a Cyber and Critical Technology Intelligence Centre. And the reason I did that was, there are a couple of reasons actually. One was that I was frustrated that when it came to presenting assessments and advice to government on cyber, that often we took a very narrow sort of technical position and didn't situate that very deep expert insight in a broader strategic context that made sense to really busy policymakers. So we've all sat in briefings probably with a chart flashed up on the wall with coloured boxes showing that some actor's, done something to a whole lot of networks, and everyone kind of looks at it and goes, oh, that looks really bad.
That might be bad. I think that might be bad.
And, next item. So anyway, I caricature, but I think you get the point. And then the other part of this is, we collectively were kind of back-footed by 5G and some of the developments there, and really, as a intelligence community, we shouldn't have been, like it was a knowable thing. But we didn't have a way of sort of bringing together our thinking, scanning the horizon for those new technologies. And so this centre, to me, will be about sort of reaching out to the, again, outside government and thinking really hard about, the problem that you're asking me about and that I'm slightly avoiding answering.
I hadn't noticed, it's fine.
But so I see this as a really important sort of, in a way, warning function for our government. It's also interesting to me that government's quite fragmented on these issues, and there aren't too many nodes where you can pull the whole picture together, and I think there's a real appetite in our system for that, and I suspect in your system too. I mean, when I think about what's coming, I mean, the obvious one is artificial intelligence. Patrick's persuaded me that this is going to be massively consequential with vast upsides, but also a pretty big sort of risk surface. And our role in providing that step back, integrating analysis that connects different things, that isn't just driven by the sort of immediate, that ability to step back and join the dots and think about how to think about something complex and then help frame complexity for government. I think around artificial intelligence, that's a huge role for us. And that can help obviously inform how government tackles the opportunities and the threats around AI. But there's also just the piece about how we use it and bring it in, and I think there's a risk in all our systems, and I go back to risk appetite here, that we kind of look at it and it's terrifying, and with the mindset is, well, let's deal with all the risk, and I kind of get that, and we do need to have policies and procedures and so forth in place and make sure that privacy is protected and all of our legal obligations are met and so forth. But ultimately, we've got to just bring it in and try it out and use it and figure out how it can help us, because our adversaries certainly are. And again, I think that's challenging. It challenges us because it's going to be so disruptive in so many ways, across the workforce. But it's not one of those things that you can kind of opt out of and sit to one side. So I think that's one. I think whenever I'm with my very good friend and fantastic partner, D&I Haynes, she talks biotech, and I think that's another one where it's coming a little further out, but in a way its manifestations are going to be even more sort of complex and with many more sort of second, third, fourth order effects that we're only just beginning to grapple with. And then quantum again. My kind of liberal arts mind really sort of struggles a bit with AI and is taken well out of its depth on quantum. We have a brilliant quantum scientist, Michelle Simmons, in Australia, and she's really patient with me, but she's got some more work to do. But I'm pretty convinced that there are going to be at least some applications around quantum computing, around sensing, for example, navigation, timing, all those sorts of things that are going to be pretty profound. So that's just a few that I'm watching, and I share your frustration about sort of the Christmas tree of sort of lists of
right.
Everyone wants to hang their own bauble.
And it really does get down to the thing we were discussing earlier too with economics. And so much of this is how do you define national security? If national security is also economics, then the universe of technologies is much bigger. But I'm glad you did raise quantum, because I know that Australia is doing some really impressive work in the quantum area. On the AI piece, we wrote a paper a couple of years ago where we envisioned Oscar, who was going to be this assistant sitting next to you as an intelligence analyst and help you sort through massive amounts of information. I think the promise there is really spectacular, but as you point out, there's also peril as well in trying to put in place the ethical constraints, the verification of the data, the protection of the data, the verification that the output is as good as it needs to be. But I mean, I would love it if gone were the days when I had to task an analyst at 5 p.m. to spend all night reading so that they could have something ready at 5 the next morning in something that a machine could, in theory, do.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the promise is tantalising. It's also, I think, it's fair to say, for our analytic community, it's pretty challenging. Mm-hmm. When I was a young analyst, you could sort of read your take, which was pushed at you pretty much, depending on your responsibilities, and you could have a fair handle on whatever the sort of sum total of open source and classified knowledge was of a particular problem, or at least you could kid yourself that you had that. And you weren't going to be found out or caught out, if you didn't. I think it's really challenging for analysts to lean fully on a tool like AI. That fear that's deep in the gut of every analyst.
Sure. What did I miss?
That you missed the needle in the haystack of needles, or whatever. And I think, and this is the work Patrick's been leading at my organisation, is just making people more knowledgeable and more comfortable and more confident about the technology and its understanding its limitations as well as its potential is going to be hugely important. As the head of our IC, and there's a kind of partner piece here that's really important too, right? Going back to what I said in a different context, our governments are going to be better aligned if we share as much as possible an assessment of what's happening in our strategic context. It's really important to me that I can understand technique, not only data, but techniques that are being used by your agencies, because you share so much with us and it's so important to us. So US assessments about the conflict in the Middle East, for example, really, really critical for us. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who has to look our Prime Minister in the eye and say, I understand the data and the analytical technique that's produced this assessment. And so it's really important that you don't sort of vanish. I use the sort of bike peloton sort of metaphor here, that you don't pedal off over the horizon, leaving the rest of us sort of in the dust, because we will be, that that connectivity and that contestability that is hardwired into the Five Eyes arrangements will be eroded if we don't sort of move, together on these new technologies.
Yep, it's an excellent point. Well, right at the end here, we have a ton of questions rolling in, but I will pull out one from another friend of CSIS, who's Captain Joshua Himes from the Joint Staff Vice Director for Intelligence. I love this question. He says, the Defense Intelligence Agency's former Deputy Director for Commonwealth Integration, New Zealand Army Major General John Howard, was fond of delivering yes-forn coffee mugs to colleagues to reinforce the importance of starting with shared knowledge. I love that, yes-forn. So for those in the audience who maybe have not been deep in the intelligence world, we have a designation called no foreign, which means that this is not to be shared with any foreign partners.
We call that no fun sometimes as well.
I like that. It's a good fun. So yes, foreign coffee mugs. How do we continue to sustain yes, foreign momentum?
I think this is a real issue. I know it's a real issue. I'd go back to my comment about the war on terror when the events that triggered that was so traumatic and real that it changed our psychology about sharing, and it overnight flipped the whole risk equation. And when I look at the sort of double and triple stacked threats that we're dealing with now, some of which frankly are more consequential in their strategic impact and implications. It's a failure of strategic imagination to leave any impediments in place to closer sharing and cooperation between us. I look at the trajectory of events and capabilities. I track intent as best as I can. I don't see anything there to reassure me very much. And I see a lot of business as usual in our kind of mindsets and approaches and cultures. So I just think we have more work to do. When I talk to my US counterparts, there's really strong commitment to break through these impediments, including the one you mentioned. There'll always be some information that remains, sovereign to governments, but that should be the exception, the small exception, and I think as leaders we need to keep making clear our intent in our organisations and making the case. The related area we were talking about before, defence exports and licensing restrictions, again, if you look at the threats and challenges we're facing and the sort of changing strategic outlook that drove the AUKUS initiative and made 3 governments take an unprecedented sort of step, that suggests to me that the signal is we're serious, we understand that the world's changing, that we need more capability, we need more deterrence. That suggests to me that other impediments that get in the way of us effectively becoming a single large shared defence industrial enterprise need to be swept away as well and not left to linger just through sort of bureaucratic inertia or, turf protection or whatever's going on there.
Well, I want to be sure we close with the pitch. And the pitch is come and help us solve these problems. So if you were going to talk to somebody who was thinking about signing up for Australia's intelligence services today, what would you tell them?
This is recruitment's really challenging right now in Australia. I'm sure it is here. And, we have additional sort of, as it were, barriers to entry, right? Like lengthy security vetting. We're working on getting those timelines down. And other, government pay versus what you might be able to receive in the private sector in one of these high-tech areas, for example. The thing that's most encouraging to me is when I get face-to-face with young Australians, that there's no change in their appetite to be part of serving their country. And the main thing we have going for us is our sense of mission and purpose, and it's how we connect people to that more effectively. We're looking at multi-classification workforces much more, where we can bring people in at lower levels of clearance. A lot of our work, frankly, can be done at a lower level of security clearance perfectly effectively, but also it can keep someone attached to your organisation while you go through the longer processes for a higher level clearance. So, you know, that's one example. I think breaking down, again, the barriers to movement between agencies, so it's a much more compelling proposition, I think, to a young Australian, and I assume American, if you can say, it's not 1970, we don't expect you to join at the bottom of this organisation and spend the next 50 years working your way up however far, but here's a career, a really varied career across 10 different agencies where your security clearance will be recognised, and you can build a career that has a whole lot of different experiences and makes you a more complete intelligence professional in the process. And to do that, we've rationalised our top secret security vetting in one agency with one agreed national standard for clearances. And guess what? You know, if you're from agency X and you want to transfer to agency Y will now recognise your clearance and not make you go through a whole new process and fill in all the same forms again.
It's crazy talk.
I know, fancy, new steps.
That's great. I mean, this is a pitch for the USIC as well, that you can have one career, 10 very different jobs, and serve your country at the same time. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us a little while today. I know you were very busy in your trip to Washington, and we, of course, welcome back our friends of CSIS anytime. But thank you for coming today. Join me in thanking him.
My pleasure. Thanks, Emily.